Wow, been a few since we actually had a full regular episode of this series up, right? For reasons that, look, really there isn't one, other than it's the end of the year, lots of other work to do, most of it involving every fucking film studio deciding to still demand film critics watch their award season screeners a few weeks before January, even though they held almost everything from major theaters. Many of us didn't go to major theaters because of the pandemic, many theaters closed because of the pandemic, or they opted to spread them out among a dozen different streaming services not everyone else has instead. Super fun, so had to catch up on that. Plus, it is the holidays, the world is turning back on a bit, and I did want to try and enjoy some family time now that we've all been reminded that we live in a world where viral apocalypse can just happen now because some dumb white trash feels sad about economic anxiety and elect morons who don't know how germs work to lead the free world for a while. So in case you dumb motherfuckers decide to almost kill us all again in 2024, I'm going to enjoy the time I have. Thank you very much.
Dear Lord, that's the loudest profanity I've ever heard.
Oh, I also had very complicated scripts to co-write for Film Theory here and there about the MCU, and a few other things because they finally turned the movies on again. Those were fun. Have you been watching? You should. Anyway, speaking of film critics and Marvel movies, the internet really had a normal one about Eternals, huh?
I don't know what we're yelling about!
Just when you thought the discourse betwixt fandom, review aggregates, and nebulous concept of film Twitter couldn't possibly get any stupider than the entire idiotic episode of hounding Martin Scorsese about superhero movies.
Loud noises!
We get an entire episode, like in the behavioral sense, about whether or not it's the end of the world or even a meaningful event that a Marvel Studios production didn't crack the upper percentile on Rotten Tomatoes. And, well, spoiler warning, it wasn't. The audience score was still way the hell up there. The movie is going to be somewhere between 387 and 390 million worldwide by the time this episode runs, and that's without even opening in China yet. 7th biggest US release of 2021, 9th biggest global release, B cinema score on the lower end for MCU movies, but every other studio in the industry would kill for those results. Like, I'm not even joking. Warner Brothers would sacrifice that little Chalamet kid in a Wicker Man if they thought there was a B+ cinema score and 390 mil on the other side of it. So basically, for another cycle, if Kevin Feige were a badly dated 90s SNL sketch, he'd be this one.
I am bulletproof.
But okay, people being weird about the stupid tomato meter isn't new, and normally I avoid talking about that because then you have to answer, well, why do you participate in this stupid broken system if you resent it so much? And, there isn't a better answer to that than...
I do this for a living!
I have to, to eat. But this time I feel like everyone gets that this was weird because it was somehow unexpected, right? Like, sure, I grant everything has been turned just slightly topsy-turvy inside out by the COVID distortion field, but despite the general discourse best effort to remain wholly cynical when it comes to the Disney machine, because heaven forfend anyone show a sliver of sincerity or vulnerability about anything ever, I feel the culture has managed to absorb a shared sense that Eternals was being carefully managed to release as the different Marvel movie, at least as a branding exercise, with the trailers downplaying the action in favor of meditative scenery, the pre-release hype focusing on Chloe Zhao's esoteric influences, the diversity of the casting, that it was more of a drama, that it was based on this utterly bizarre Jack Kirby comic from the 70s that was never actually all that popular, and nobody really understood at the time, that she pitched it to the studio with a slideshow about sand and poetry, all that kind of thing.
I am your washing machine.
Plus, they were dropping it in the late fall, not too far out from Spider-Man as a cleanup hitter, which is something you tend to do if you don't necessarily think you've got a months-long dominant smash on your hands, so your other movies don't need to clear a path for it. The general vibe felt, okay, maybe this is the one they're expecting the general audience and maybe the Marvel fan base to not totally be on board with because they're trying something more experimental and branching out, but this kind of quasi-art house, high-minded fare also tends to score big with critics, so this will be the one where the reviews are really good, but regular Joes are scratching their heads, and instead it was almost the exact opposite of that. The critics were really hard on it, commonly citing issues like being overlong, pretentious, hard to engage characters, confusing plotting, and also a lot of the usual technical storytelling, we're just tired of this genre so we're gonna bitch about it stuff levied at most Marvel Cinematic Universe releases, but also here not tempered by the oh but the jokes work and gotta love those recurring characters beats that seem to still net the rest of the extended franchise its more positive overall notices. But meanwhile, Joe Popcorn didn't seem to have the issues even I was expecting a lot more Marvel and genre fans to have, honestly. It was definitively more of a divisive, polarizing thing than either Shang-Chi or Black Widow were, but not to any absurd degree, and the divisiveness seemed much more about tone, content, and not necessarily connecting with the characters and overall premise than not being able to figure it out, or follow the concept, or grasp the meaning of the big ideas, symbolism, philosophy, etc. If anything, the anecdotal chatter I managed to observe around even ordinary filmgoers who didn't necessarily love it is that they thought the idea behind the big new weird stuff about Celestials, origins of the universe, and especially what's going to happen when the other Marvel persons find out about it and get involved is pretty interesting. Basically, it almost feels like something that was either designed or more likely had its marketing campaign designed to be the Marvel Disney blockbuster version of a weirdo, critical, darling, awards bait film snob art house movie that the normies didn't get was actually grasped just fine by said normies, and the quote-unquote snobs were the ones who were decidedly unimpressed. So what actually happened here?
Where'd I go just now?
Because not only is it weird for this studio to make a marketing mistake or a release mistake, which, okay, again, debatable whether or not they actually did, since, most studios' mistakes don't end up earning back 2 to 3 times what they cost and sending audiences home mostly going, hey, that was pretty good. It's weird that they'd make a mistake while even starting from a plan as unusual as spend almost $100 million making a movie aimed at critics that our regular audience won't get into. I mean, even yes, for Disney, who are not necessarily strangers to strategic thinking in terms of be okay with something only being a modest success when you've got a much longer-term plan for it that's going to take years of nurture to pay off. Well, first thing is I think people need to readjust their terminology and conception of genre. Eternals is a weird one, just like it was as a comic, but 20 years out from The Matrix in a world where the History Channel used to rerun Ancient Aliens multiple times a day, it's no longer that weird. And narratively, it has a pretty straightforward storyline with a solid flashback structure. To the degree it genuinely feels unusual is largely about tone and affect, the way it uses visual and audio language more at home in Zhao's other films, and more abstract sci-fi movies like 2001 or Stream of Consciousness movies like the openly acknowledged influence of Terrence Malick. Phrased another way, you might say it's what a Zack Snyder movie would look like if he was way into yoga instead of CrossFit, but we're not reviewing the movie again here. Basically, when I say this seemed like Marvel trying to do their version of an art house blockbuster, we're not talking like the Marvel version of a David Lynch movie, and not just because the Marvel version of a David Lynch movie already came out and was called WandaVision and was also a huge success. So, bad word choice there anyway.
I know you hate saying what things mean in your films, but am I right in thinking that that's at least in the right area? No.
That interviewer was Mark Kermode, by the way, and if you're wondering, hey, did he ever recover? Like, was he ever okay again after that experience? Well, this was him not too long ago, like just this past year, reviewing the Clifford movie.
Firstly, Clifford is too big for this story to work. Okay, in a live-action film, Clifford is too big. So you see Clifford in the room. Clifford is he's not just going to mess the room up. He's going to destroy the room. Okay, it's a dog that's that big. That's the end of that.
Ah, gee, that's a shame. Anyway, when the film world says art house blockbuster, it's generally more of a tongue-in-cheek description of when a critically lauded director gets tapped to make the expensive version of their established mood board aesthetic, sometimes but not always molded onto the skeleton of a big franchise or literary adaptation. Usually marketed as a visual-heavy, dialogue-light trailer with big panoramic establishing shots and loud Christopher Nolan bwong horns. Basically think Darren Aronofsky doing Noah, Ava DuVernay doing Wrinkle in Time, Alex Garland on Annihilation, Denis Villeneuve showing so much as his vacation slides with an eyesight of a critic's circle, basically that kind of thing. That's more what the initial marketing for Eternals was positioning it as, with the slow wide shots and the meditative music and the lack of plot information, moody atmosphere, people standing on a beach, fields of wheat, though whether or not that was wholly representative of the final product is, as those who saw it can attest, up for discussion, since there is actually more than enough standard superhero fare in there that once it was clear they weren't going to get the art house blockbuster critic reception they were probably angling for, they were able to cut the trailers more like this.
Do you know why I love movies?
The fans.
And the fans have spoken. Marvel's Eternals is the #1 movie in the world 2 weeks in a row.
Hell yes.
Don't miss the film that will change the Marvel Universe forever.
I'm sure that was a lot of fun for you.
It was.
Marvel's Eternals.
Can we go to space, too?
Let's wait till you get your learner's permit, okay?
Rated PG-13. Now play.
So speaking of the fans have spoken, does that mean that what happened was audiences were actually smarter than everyone gave them credit for? I don't know about that. That would also mean that anyone who didn't like it was wrong, and we're not getting into that, and also somehow handing the public a lot of undue credit, so not really in my opinion. What I think we mainly saw happen here is a demonstration of the divide between critics and audiences, no surprise there, but also how much of the people fundamentally don't understand what constitutes the world of film criticism as a profession, hobby, culture, etc. over the last decade or so in terms of what's happened to it. See, when it comes to the subject of film critics versus Marvel, which really means film critics versus superhero movies, which really means film critics versus popular movies movies period, but whatever. The strange aspect of the whole discourse is that two simultaneous points everyone seems to assume are true are that critics hate these movies, but also these movies are overrated. And if you interact with the world of film culture, particularly on social media, that absolutely appears to be true, even though it doesn't appear to make sense, and in fact appears to be two contradictory statements existing in the same space. The nebulous collection of film aficionados, writers, critics, reviewers, entertainment journals, etc. that comprise amorphous cliques like Film Twitter are either reflexively dismissive or openly hostile to the Marvel movies, etc., yet the entire origin of Eternal's review percentage discourse was that it's really unusual for Marvel movies to not score really high on Rotten Tomatoes, etc. These films generally get really positive reviews there. So what was up with that?
What the fuck is the internet?
The internet is a communications tool used the world over where people can come together to bitch about movies and share pornography with one another.
Well, speaking as a film critic whose reviews are part of the Rotten Tomatoes calculation, everyone's idea of what a film critic is as a job and personality is laughably out of date, like absurdly so. When most people hear the word film critic, if they have an image in their head of what that means at all, they're probably picturing someone like Roger Ebert, Gene Siskel, maybe colorful characters like Gene Shalit. If you came up in the early internet era, you remember the days of Film Threat or Ain't It Cool News, so people like Chris Gore or Harry Knowles, and of course Jay Sherman, the animated character John Lovitz voiced in the TV series of The Critic. And you know, there's a younger generation that mainly thinks of video reviewer characters, I'm sure, like James Rolfe, Channel Awesome before all that went to hell, you know, maybe myself back in the before time, but that's a whole other discussion. Point is, even setting aside that Roger and Gene have left us both, that whole era of film criticism, that's been over for a long time. Along with the single subject print and TV journalism as self-sustaining middle-class career in its own right ecosystem in which it existed. The image of a film critic that Jay Sherman satirized in The Critic, an upper-middle-class educated academic who jetted off to film festivals, lived in a fancy apartment, hobnobbed with lower-tier celebrities, and basically lived comfortably in the margins of the actual entertainment business, with having to suffer through crummy Hollywood movies as a bills-paying grind part of his job, but it was worth it because otherwise he got paid to study and share his true passion about classic cinema where and when he could. Yeah, that utopia was murdered 15 years ago when Facebook lied about some data points and got every outlet in media to pivot to video. We lost so many good people for absolutely no reasons, and if I ever get my hands on Zuckerberg... Anyway, most film critics today, myself included, also cover multiple other subjects and or have a side hustle.
Hello, it's 6 a.m. and this is English for cab drivers. Good morning, class. My life is a living hell. The only thing that gets me through the day is lithium.
And the writers, content creators covering mainstream new releases for weekly outlets, i.e. most of the reviewers that are going to be counting a tomato meter score, aren't generally part of the demographic cohort you're picturing when you think old-time film snob critic, i.e. the Siskel and Ebert model or the Jay Sherman caricature. Most of the people in that mold checked out ages ago from those gigs. They either write books or have Substack blogs, or otherwise they only cover what they want to cover, so they're usually not even bothering to review Marvel movies or most new blockbusters unless it's filmmakers or actors they specifically care about, and that's the group that generally comprises the film Twitter and or movie fandom intelligentsia film discourse. And while many of them were critics, they aren't really the press as it exists in the day-to-day operative sense now. Instead, the young, hungry, hireable enough people to be doing the work for mainstream outlets are generally younger, in their 20s and 30s, which means they're exactly the demographic wheelhouse for whom not only the Marvel movies and their complete dominance of the blockbuster landscape have always been a normal part of their adult lives, they're intimately familiar with the way the other side of movie fandom, i.e. the general audience, gets if critics are perceived as not being deferential to popular cinema. Nobody likes a snob who hates everything is what made their predecessors so replaceable in the first place.
Why the hell do you have to be so critical?
I'm a critic.
No, your job is to rate movies on a scale from good to excellent.
What if I don't like them?
That's what good's for.
And while I've never bought into the dopey conspiracy theory that the entertainment press is bought off by Disney to give them good reviews, because no, nobody's paying anyone bribes. Nobody's paying anyone anything.
Well, I've got this one job, but I think it's beneath you.
I'll take it. Believe me, I'm at the end of my rope. Wait a minute, it's not on Fox, is it?
No.
I'll take it.
I do think there's some truth to the idea that the critical consensus, especially among the generation that's come up with lifelong awareness of how social media swarming and mass culture call response works, sometimes, goes easy on just good enough movies that are part of really popular major brands, major trends, or that, everyone was just looking forward to because nobody wants to be a party pooper. Basically the opposite inverse effect of when something like Showgirls or Freddy Got Fingered back in the day would get tagged as the worst thing ever, and everyone would get in a rush to one-up each other, finding new ways to let everyone know they also agreed it was terrible, when, no, those were never even the worst films of their respective year. And while I want to be 100% clear here, I'm not accusing, nor would I accuse anyone of lying about a review or opinion or whatever. I'm definitely not saying anyone wasn't honest in appraising Eternals. Divisive, unusual movie was divisive because it was unusual. It happens. I think the answer to what went askew when it came to the expectations of critics and audiences in this movie was at least partly due to that kind of consensus call-response effect playing itself.
Congratulations, you played yourself.
You know what the last page in the book is? A mirror, so you can see exactly who blew it, being you.
Basically, I wonder if in Marvel Disney's marketing subtly leaning so hard on creating this subtextual idea of this will be the different Marvel movie that Marvel fans might reject or at least be divided on because it's so different, the unintended consequence wasn't for a lot of the critics to, for lack of a better word, let their guard down, i.e., oh, so this is the one where people won't send angry letters to my editor if I give it a C-? Well, in that case, I'm going to pay much closer attention and use the sharp scalpel this time. Now, that's not to say that people lied or were dishonest, but the problem with percentage-based aggregate sites is that the closer you get to the middle of positive or negative, or the more nuance there is between a like or a dislike. I mean, again, as someone who does this for a living and often has to parse for himself whether or not a middle-of-the-road review should be called a positive or a negative, sometimes it's really all in how you word things. There is, again, nuance between like and dislike, and the meter is really bad at reflecting that. Again, I didn't write this episode up to argue with people about Eternals or even Marvel movies and their reviews in general. My feeling that the MCU is basically a collection of solid B-plus movies and occasional home runs that add up to more than the sum of its parts is well established. I already reviewed Eternals, I thought it was just fine, and at this point I think seeing what everyone else thinks of it when it's on Disney Plus in January is what will tell the tale there. I was much more interested in getting out that overall point that people need to look at the landscape of what criticism, commentary, review, and journalism is now versus what you think it is based on outdated caricatures of what it used to be, because too often the audience and us really are talking past one another and not enough people are acknowledging that, and I feel like it's an important conversation.
Tomorrow, this essay will appear in every major newspaper in America. But I'll reach more people by reading it on this low-rated early morning cable TV show.
Anyway, now I've said my piece about that, got it out of my system, expect a few more reviews and new content coming soon. I'm Bob, happy holidays, and have a happy new year.